I've been grading papers, and you've been either grading or writing papers, so today we're going to address 7 lies you probably learned in grammar class, and 3 things you maybe didn't learn at all. But before we start, let's briefly discuss the reasoning behind them. You may not have known this, but up in English Grammar Rules Tower, they have been fighting each other for centuries. At one end of the table are people who say, language evolves. We should be describing English the way people use it. And at the other end they argue, but if we don't enforce rules about how to use it, there'll be confusion, mass hysteria, and worst of all, misunderstood arguments. The rules described in this video will hopefully sidestep this debate by instead focusing on what's practical in communicating successfully. Rule number 1 of this perspective is to consider your audience, which most likely consists of people at both ends of that spectrum. Ideally, your writing shouldn't confuse or distract either the grammar sticklers or the people who are happily living their lives without considering the subtleties of Oxford comma use, whereas those at one end might specifically point out a misplaced comma or preposition. Those at the other end are more likely to just lose interest if they can't tell what you mean, or misinterpret you entirely. So most of the time, these grammar rules exist to help avoid confusion for the reader, but some might require a nuanced application to achieve this goal. Ready? Here we go. You were probably taught to use which after a comma, and that if there's no comma. This is a good rule of thumb, but you've probably noticed there are some sentences that can make sense either way. You can use the comma which combination or the no comma that combination. So how do you pick? The answer is that you should use that when you need the reader to understand a new category or specify exactly what you're talking about. For example, the food which is healthy suggests that all food is healthy, or that the reader already knows which food you're talking about. The food that is healthy suggests to the reader that you're specifying a new category of food, the healthy kind, and you're focusing their attention on the healthy food as a topic. Teachers will often say that if you're writing a list of things, it's up to you whether to include a comma after the second to last item. This comma is called the Oxford comma, and it's not exactly optional. There are lots of cases in which not having that comma will cause confusion. A famous example is, I invited the strippers, JFK and Stalin. Without that extra comma, you might get the impression that JFK and Stalin have picked up a new hobby. Okay, you probably wouldn't presume that, those names were picked to illustrate that point, but replace them with, I invited the strippers, Bruce and Stanley, whom you have not met, and suddenly you become very curious about the author's intent. In this case, the Oxford comma reduces confusion. However, there are counterexamples. One famous example is, I'd like to thank my mother, Ayn Rand, and God. Wait, is this a list of 3 items? Or is the author clarifying that she is Ayn Rand's child? Did Ayn Rand have any children? In this case, eliminating the Oxford comma reduces confusion. Ayn Rand no longer appears to be a clarifying interjection, and it would be hard for the reader to think that the author's mother is both Ayn Rand and God. If you look through style and usage guides, they pretty uniformly say this is okay. The purpose of this rule was to make it easier to translate into Latin, in which prepositions always precede the words they modify.
Anybody know post hoc, ergo, propter hoc, Josh?
Post, after hoc, ergo, therefore. After hoc, therefore something else hoc.
Thank you. Next.
However, in English, you can eliminate a lot of confusion if your sentence ends in a preposition. The only people who want to read a sentence like, that is something up with which I will not put, are grammar pedants making a point. Everyone else gets confused. Still, if you're writing for an audience that might include some grammar sticklers who haven't cracked open a usage guide lately, it might be worth revising the sentence just to avoid the whole ordeal. I would guess this rule got started because grade school teachers were trying to teach their students to avoid sentence fragments like, and also the turtles. But writers have been starting English sentences with these words for about as long as English has been a thing. As long as you've got a full English sentence with subject and verb afterward, it's perfectly okay to start your sentences with these words from time to time. Y'all's totally a word. Okay, maybe don't put it in your college essays, but many languages other than English have a separate pronoun to address multiple people instead of just one person. Y'all reduces confusion, because the alternative is to use the word you to refer to a single person and multiple people. The consequence of which being that the listener might say, wait, did you mean me or all of us? Dictionaries and style guides agree. Okay, you might need to be a bit older to have heard this one in school. This rule got started because of typewriters, which printed every character at the same width. People argued it was easier for people to find sentence breaks and understand long texts if they had that extra bit of white space to guide their eyes. But for the most part, people have abandoned this rule, thanks mostly to the internet and its fancy fonts and automatic kerning. You may still have one or two older professors who will require it, but for the most part, you can get away with either one or two spaces in your writing. An infinitive is a verb without a specified subject or time. In English, infinitive verbs usually have to in front of them. That's not true of a lot of other languages, including Latin. So the rule supposedly went that you shouldn't put any words in between to and the verb it precedes, just in case you want to translate into Latin. Now, in most cases, you can avoid both confusion and distracting the grammar sticklers by just moving the words elsewhere. However, there are occasions in which moving the words elsewhere would only create confusion. For example, rates are expected to more than double. And who wants to hear Picard say, "To go boldly where no one has gone before"? No one. That's who. Finally, a few points that you probably didn't hear any misinformation about, but are worth mentioning anyway. Sometime around when people start to pick up that which is somehow a fancier word than that, they also start throwing in longer words to make their writing more verbose and sound fancier. Maybe it's because of word requirements on papers. But in most cases, the simpler way to say something is the better way. For example, utilize is a separate word from use, with a separate meaning, basically to maximize the efficient use of. If you're not writing for a chemistry class or an economics class for which you know why utilize is the word you're looking for, you probably just mean use. Same with in actuality. Actually almost always communicates the same thing in fewer words. Okay, so scientists are to blame for this one. It had been a long-standing rule to avoid using the first person. So instead of saying things like, "we ran an experiment," or "we manipulated the variables," people write that an experiment was run, or "these variables were manipulated." The reasoning was that it might carry a tone of objectivity if the writing didn't seem connected to the specific humans who conducted the study. But what scientists saw as a benefit is a problem for most other writing. It leaves open the question of who is taking those actions. And when it's not an open question, as in the variables were manipulated by us, the passive voice just leaves more room for confusion compared to "we manipulated the variables." Even the APA guide has become more lenient in allowing use of the first person to avoid the use of the passive voice. American English is disappointingly counterintuitive on this one, but semicolons, colons, and dashes always go outside quotation marks, commas and periods always go inside, and exclamation marks or question marks place depends on whether or not it was part of the original quote. In British English, commas and periods placement also depends on whether or not it's part of the original quote, which, if you ask me, makes a whole lot more sense. So, to wrap up, yes, in many cases, people will understand you and know what you're talking about, even if you don't follow the rules. But in a lot of those cases, it's because you're writing and speaking to people who already know and love you and care enough to try to figure out what you mean. Becoming a better writer means communicating with people who don't care about you at all. It means convincing them to keep reading so you can hopefully convince them of your arguments. There's much more to persuading people than just grammar and usage, but the first step is making sure people don't give up just because they don't understand you. Today's book recommendation is Brian Garner's Modern English Usage, available today. Sign up now for your free trial on Audible. We're not sponsored by Audible?
There's even audiobooks for
And there's no such thing as audiobooks of style guides? No one listens to those?
I don't know if anybody's ever told you.
We're not sponsored by anybody?
Who are you even talking to?
There's no one over here? I'm just talking to myself? Wait, I promised you comment replies. Unfortunately, this video is running a bit long, so we're gonna get to those next time. Stick around and subscribe to see. Today we're going to discuss 7 lies you probably learned in glamour class. Welcome to glamour class.